Thank you so much, panel. Very interesting discussion. My name is Jim Shear. I'm at the Wilson Center. And I'd like to cycle back to a point that Raymond made about security partnering in Africa, in particular the concern he expressed, and I think rightly so, about the overemphasis on the training and equipping model for future security partnering between the U.S. and African countries. Yes, indeed, there are definite limitations. One can recall hearing from various West African militaries during the Ebola outbreak that they felt they had very poor logistics, for example. So training and equipping doesn't necessarily help you if you have to move a lot of stuff to deal with a pandemic outbreak. The bigger problem, though, is the ongoing counterterrorism mission imperative and the need to do training and equipping for partners engaged in that mission as an alternative to either the U.S. endlessly intervening or doing nothing. So the challenge, though, here is how do you train, and we're talking typically elite forces, while at the same time avoiding a situation where we're creating self-perceived winners and losers within a given country. And we've seen that that has not played out well in some cases. So quick question as a potential remedy, not a remedy, but an offset, if you will, to this particular priority, which continues post OEF, OIF. Is there an argument for expanding the amount of partnering with African militaries in the civil works area? Thinking of Senegal, for example, as a positive model where the Senegalese military has contributed to national development through basic civil works missions. There are issues there associated with blurring the boundary line between security and development, and potentially some contention and controversy, but it strikes me that building civil capacity, civil interest in national military establishments is an important and probably still deficient feature in the landscape that we see today. Thank you so much.
We'll start with Raymond.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jim, for that question. I think the issues surrounding security and security institutions on the continent continue to challenge us. I talked a bit about the train and equip, and one of the challenges across the continent is that you have security sector institutions that have national security acts, that have budgets, and that have org structures that are more relevant to the Second World War than they are to today. You go to war colleges across the continent, they're still teaching classical, warfare. And you look across the continent, what are the threats? What do you require of your security sector? It's completely different. And this is where I think we have an opportunity as we engage to think beyond traditional train and equip, to start focusing them on the issues that really matter. If you take Liberia, for instance, the Liberian military, initially when you had the Ebola crisis, there was a slight misstep initially, but subsequently they became exactly what they needed to be. They became the force enablers. I was in Arusha, Tanzania, a few weeks back, and there was a conversation about, of course, this is not something the military should be doing, but just an example that there was a significant donation of school books for schools across Tanzania, which arrived from the United States. And these books arrived, I think, a couple of weeks before the start of the academic year. And everyone said, this cannot be done. And the president said, bring in the army. And the army did it. So it's not what the army should be doing, but when it comes to increasingly, the countries are going to be facing natural disasters, humanitarian crises, refugee flows, IDPs, etc. And the security sector needs to be prepared and equipped to address those things, because that matters more for security than a Praetorian Guard that is armed to the teeth. And so I think one of the things that we put on the table is we really need to take a more creative look at what constitutes security in the African continent, and then decide what sort of institutions require and how we could be more impactful. The United States does a significant amount in helping train, in helping sensitize and organize, providing advice, but we need to go beyond that to start helping countries think a little bit more strategically and in a forward-leaning manner. What are the threats you are going to be facing in the outer years, and how do we prepare for that?
Peter?
I agree with everything Raymond has said, but I would add an important caveat, because, for example, in Liberia, the example he cites, which I think is as close as we can get in Africa as to the gold standard with the way the security sector reform was done. But we had the mechanisms, we had the institutions to do security sector reform. We didn't have that same architecture to do political sector reform or bureaucracy reform, to the point where we now have a military that is fully vetted, human rights compliant. After the one misstep, they did pretty well. All those things, you know, every officer started out as a private and became an NCO, and they went to officer, all to the gold standard. But then we still have war criminals and murderers in the national parliament. You know, I've said in Liberia publicly, so I'll say again here, that, you know, if that isn't changed at some point, this military may march the politicians back down to the beach again. And if I were a Liberian, I'd probably be there waving a palm frond to cheer them on. And so we've got to come up, I think this is a task for the next administration, to think of how we can come up with the architecture to do what we can do when we have the resources to the security sector in other sectors as well.
And probably if I just add something very quickly, just to buttress what Peter just said. You know, we have to think about security sector assistance within the context of the broader assistance that we could provide to the country, because beyond just looking at the security sector, some of the security threats require development or infrastructure or other initiatives that we can do, and this is where the balancing comes in.
I'll just very quickly say I agree with the points that have been made. I think that that there's ample room for thinking about what more can be done, particularly in the civil policing space, and really thinking about what's the demand in terms of what are the skill sets that people need, and how to provide that on a more significant scale than what we currently are able to do. I take the point about not wanting to have kind of unintended consequences from the kind of picking winners or some perception that you're broadening the rift between elite forces and others. At the same time, I think sometimes it's easy to look at the resources that we've got and end up deploying them to solve problems with the security sector that really don't originate with the security sector, and then the security sector is not actually the right tool to address them. And so I think there's a case-by-case element to this, and the security architecture and the kind of human resources administration piece is different in different places. But I'm very wary of this idea that we should always make sure, you know, everybody got an ice cream cone. That's not what this is for, and we can very quickly go down that road. I know that's not what you were proposing in your question, but I actually think it is a danger.
Just to follow on Michelle's point, I mean, I wonder sometimes if kind of the U.S. kind of overweening emphasis on the military kind of reinforces the tendency to look to the military for the solution for everything, versus community police, for example, who really, you know, you're going to have to move to some kind of community policing approach if you're looking at the Sahel, or if you're looking at countering Boko Haram, you know, among communities and guarding against asymmetrical attacks and working with the communities on engagement and intel and so forth. So, you know, I think it's kind of along with what Raymond was saying, we don't want to reinforce a tendency for military solutions.